My name is Aneta Petkova. I'm a QA lead at SumUp. And for the past several months, my main focus has been on building and extending different automation frameworks within the company. So it was really easy to choose this topic for the conference today. But there is another reason behind me doing this talk. And it's something that happened to me a couple of years ago when I was teaching a course in automation testing for beginners. At the end of the course, one of the people raised his hand and said, I'm actually a little bit disappointed by this course because I was expecting that at the end of it, I will be able to create my very own automation framework. So I have to admit that I was really surprised, and not in a good way. And I don't remember what I replied back then, but probably it wasn't very graceful. So imagine that an architecture graduate who has spent 5 years learning his craft, but nevertheless, he just finished university, and he comes to you and he says, I want my first project to be the Death Star. Well, yeah, automation framework is not exactly the Death Star, but it's going to be the main residence for all your automation scenarios. So if you don't pay enough attention and you don't take good care of it, you can do some real damage on the quality of your product. With this talk today, I really want to make you ask yourself some questions. And those questions aim to make creating a framework easier for you from one side, but also make you grasp the complexity of this task that maybe you're about to embark on. So, let's get started. The number one question, of course, is what language am I going to use? And you're probably thinking, oh, this one is easy, but is it that easy? I think the first thing that you need to consider is the primary language for the project or product that you're going to test. And after that, your personal favorite. Because an automation framework should not be a personal effort. Quality should always be the responsibility of the entire team. So you want to have the buy-in of all QAs and also all developers in your team. Also, for purely selfish reasons, you wouldn't want to go on vacation and have people call you because you're the only one maintaining this thing or testing steps in the company until you get back from the sea. It's not a good idea. Another thing that people actually underestimate is the popularity of the language. But I don't mean how easy is it to find an answer to your question in Stack Overflow. Actually, here I mean that if you're doing great, at some point your team is probably going to grow and you will start doing hiring. And even though this definitely has lower priority, you might want to consider how easy are you going to hire automation QA with Erlang or Elixir. The next big question is, where is your framework going to live? To answer this, you first have to consider the architecture of the project that you're going to test. If your product has a relatively monolithic architecture and you have one component which is quite big, or at least one repository that contains all or most of your code, well, it makes perfect sense to put your framework there as well. However, if your product is highly segregated and you have multiple components living in their own repositories, how are you going to decide where to put your framework? You can split it and you can think about the most critical one, but it's a little bit more advanced. So in this situation, you might want to have a standalone repository for your tests. Also, the production branches are often protected, especially the master. And if you commit your code, test code there, it means that it will have to go to the same process of code reviewing and maybe even unit test coverage and so on. And of course, this is what we want, and this is the right way to do it. But maybe your company is not there yet. And if the developers don't take the test framework as a priority, and you have to wait a week or two for a code review of a very simple change, then maybe it's not the right process for you. And you want to commit your changes somewhere where you're not that restricted and you can move faster. One last thing to consider is how are you going to execute your test in the continuous integration? Because hopefully, at some point, you will get them there. And keeping the test in the same repository with your production code is going to make this much easier. But it's not the only way, so just keep it in mind. The third question is, which level of the testing pyramid are you aiming to test? And here I have to say a few words for this very famous term in quality, the testing pyramid, which goal is to define how many tests you need to have at which level of your architecture. So most of your tests should go in the unit framework, which is not part of this talk, but then you can test your services. Usually it's done with API tests, and finally, you want to test your user interface. You need to consider this because you will need different tools and different approaches for testing services or user interface. So it will be good that before you start building your framework, you actually ask yourself the question, am I going to test services only, user interface only, or am I going to test both? Then you will also have to consider what format do you want your test scenarios to have. And this is a really important step from purely quality point of view. Usually, when the framework is started by developers who have no official QA experience before, they go for no format. Why? Because it looks the easiest way and the most simple way with the least restrictions. What does mean no format? Well, it means that you just write a typical method or function and you put in there all the steps and verifications that usually a manual tester would do. And there is a big problem with this approach. When people write their tests like this, their methods tend to grow a lot, and at some point in time, even the author of the original scenario doesn't remember what he's testing and why he's testing it. People are putting a lot of steps in there, they're putting a lot of verifications, and they often verify something, then they do other actions and another verifications. So the focus of the tests are being lost. For this reason, a lot of people are turning to some other formats. For behavior-driven development, the most famous one is the given, when, then format. This format aims to put everything into consideration from business point of view. So, for example, if I want to test a feature of Google search, I would frame my scenario as a user, given I can open a browser and go to Google. When I search for something, then I should see the total numbers of available results. As you can see, these are plain sentences. So you still will have to write the code behind those. And oftentimes this is considered the biggest drawback of this way because you have a little bit more work to do. You still have to write your code, but also you have to write this plain text. And developers don't like writing human language. However, when you write them like this, first, everyone can understand them. You can show them to a product owner, you can show them to a manual QA. So you can receive feedback on what you're testing from basically anyone, even if they don't have programming background. But what is even more valuable is that you yourself will be able to easily see what you've been trying to achieve 1 or 2 years ago. Another problem is that the given when then frameworks are often hard to scale. So a solution for this is the screenplay format, which is probably the youngest of the three, and it's built upon the solid principles. So its main purpose is to allow you to build really big and scalable frameworks which are still very stable. Here, the main focus is put again on the user, but not the specific steps that he's taking, but rather his goal and his purpose. So here the test would sound like, as Annie, the browsing girl, which would denote that I have the capability to browse the internet, I want to see the total number of my search results on Google so that I know how many results I need to put into consideration. The screenplay format is really good, but its drawback is that it has a little bit more abstraction in it. So if you want to use it, you need to have some senior people on your team. It's usually a bit confusing for junior teams to handle this. The next thing is the test runner that you're going to use. And the test runner is the entry point for executing your tests. So in a way, it's going to be the heart of your framework, and that's why you have to choose it carefully. Of course, the first step will be taken at the moment that you choose your language, but there are other things to consider as well. The first thing is how experienced is your team? Because they are test runners, which basically work out of the box. So you just add your dependency, library, whatever, and with little to no configuration, you can just start writing your tests and executing them. And it's awesome for teams that are just starting, but very often in some time, like maybe a year, you will realize that you need more power and you need more configuration, and the solution that you chose is just not supporting this. And because the test runner is, like I said, in the heart of your framework, changing this component later in time can be very hard. So this is one of the important decisions to take. On the other hand, if you choose a runner which is highly configurable, this means that it might take a little bit longer for the team to set it up initially, and some people might even give up. Another very important thing is the features that you want your test runner to provide you. Like, for example, you will probably want to have reporting. But what kinds of reporting will you need? Do you need reporting which will be consumed by other programs, like JSON or XML? Probably you do. Do you need reporting that will be facing other people, like HTML? Maybe. Do you want your framework to be able to send email notifications? Oh, maybe you won't because you have continuous integration for this, but I don't know. Another thing that you will probably want to have is the ability to run your tests in parallel. And again, this is something that not all test runners support, and which will be a little bit hard for you to add later, even not impossible. And finally, a lot of test runners have plugins for different continuous integration systems, which means that once you include your tests in the CI process, you will be able to see not just the results of current execution, but also you can see some trends of execution over time. And finally, just like with the language, you have to consider the popularity of your test runner. The questions in Stack Overflow are important here because you have those questions and you will be searching for some help. But also, you don't want to choose something that might go out of support in the near future if you're planning to test a long-term project. Because like we said earlier, it's a little bit hard to replace the test runner at later stages of your framework. So if you want to experiment with something new and fancy, maybe you want to do this with a test framework that is going to test a product with limited lifespan or something which is smaller and easier to manage. The final thing that you want to think about before choosing your framework is what are the artifacts that you want your framework to actually give you? So what is the output that you expect to have? Again, a very important thing is the reporting. So it's very likely that you will want to integrate your results either from different frameworks, from different teams in a single place. And also, like I said, you will want to have some trends over time. So I think it's very important that whatever you do, you have some machine format reports. Some runners still produce XML, but I think that you should be looking for JSON. However, for me, it's really important that a framework can also produce a good-looking HTML report. And for a lot of people, the good-looking report is really not that important. But think about a moment where some people from the business want to see what you're testing, want to see your results. And those are people that don't really have a programming background. And you send them your report, and it looks like you've just downloaded a file from some archive from the 90s. And that's what you show them. So when these people see a very bad-looking report, they're also going to think that probably your code is not exactly the best in the world. And also, we're talking about testing, which means that we will have failures and we will be detecting potential problems. So we will have to do a lot of investigation. And to do this, we will need extensive logging. And not just extensive, but also our logs will have to be structured and formatted in the proper way, so we don't have to spend ages searching for the root cause of an issue. So we have to think about whether our framework is going to be capable to produce the right logs. Then, if you're going to test your user interface, you will definitely want to have screenshots. It's already easy because almost any library that is driving the browser will provide you with screenshots, but you will also probably want to integrate those screenshots in your report or in your continuous integration. So that's another thing to consider. And now that I've provided you with a lot of questions, I'm going to answer them for you. And my answers are not going to be for a hypothetical project, but they're going to be for a framework that we've recently started in my company. So, number one, language. I'm going for Ruby. And I have to say that I really don't feel good about it, because I'm a Java person. But my team is writing in Ruby, so I don't want to be the only one that's going to maintain this. And I'm going for Ruby. Number two, repository. The project that we're going to test consists of several components which are independent and fairly equal, so our repository is also going to be standalone. The level that we're going to test. We're aiming for testing services because we don't want to start with UI and lose a lot of time with debugging and flaky tests and so on. So for now, this is the focus that we have. But I also keep in mind that probably at some point in the future, I will want to be able to test UI. The format of my tests. The format that I've chosen is the given when then format, because I really want to put emphasis on the business goal of each scenario. And I want to make it easily visible for everyone in the team what kind of scenarios do we have, what are we testing, and what we're missing. then the test runner is really easy, because if you choose given when then, the most popular option is Cucumber, and it's available for Ruby. Finally, the artifacts that I really care about are reports, and like I said, I really want to have a beautiful HTML report and proper logs, of course. I don't care for screenshots right now, because I'm only going to do service testing. And now with these answers, I'm going to show you the structure of our framework. So I've changed some of the names and I've removed some of the sensible data, but this is an actual framework that we're using. The first module that we have, we call app, and it contains all the business logic that is important for our framework in order to function, but is not directly related to any specific test case. Which means that if the test runner is the heart of our framework, this is basically the brain. Then, of course, we need to be able to configure everything that we want to change. And we have the module that contains the features. The features is the special files that contain the test scenarios, and this name is coming directly from Cucumber. Then we have the test output, where all our reports or other artifacts should be generated. And finally, the Ruby gem files, and I have a README file because my repo is in GitHub, and I want people to be able to easily see what is this project doing, how to execute it, and so on. And now let's do sort of deep dive into those modules. Starting with the app one. First, I have a common module where I will keep utility classes and methods. Like, for example, I have a data factory, which is going to mock all kinds of data for me, like addresses or phone numbers or credit card information. Then I have a module which will be responsible for accessing the database and updating or retrieving data from there. The model is going to contain the representations of different business objects that will be used in my test, like a user, his credentials, and his personal profile. And I have the service module, where I will have all my classes that are actually interacting with my API services. Then the next module is the config one. So first, I have initializers, which are the classes that are going to take my configuration and bootstrap the application when I want to execute my tests in a specific environment, for example. I'm keeping my configuration in a YAML file, and I also have a Cucumber YAML where I have the specifics for running the Cucumber tests. And finally, I have a class which is solely responsible for building my HTML report. Moving on to the features. In Cucumber, under features, we can create several directories where we can put scenarios related to different features of our product. So in my case, I just have one, and it's the API features. And another really important module is the step definitions. So the step definitions files for Cucumber are the ones that contain the actual implementation of all those sentences that we saw. So here we are doing the actual heavy lifting. And finally, I have the support module, which again contains mostly some specifics for Cucumber, like the hooks, for example, where you can set up and tear down methods and other stuff to be run before or after each of your scenarios or features. And then we have the test output directory, where, like I said, I have my HTML report, for which I care so much, and my features report in JSON format, which is going to be consumed by continuous integration, in my case, JSON. So the specific gems that I'm using are actually not that much because my framework is really basic and I'm not using anything too fancy right now. The first thing, of course, is Cucumber because this is my test runner. Then for accessing the database, I'm using Active Record, which is the Ruby default, so nothing exotic or fancy there either. But for accessing REST services and logging, I'm using Sail, which is an internal gem that is built in our company. But before this, I was using the REST client, and I was using a gem called Coverize, which is super useful because it will put any cover that you want in your logs, and the critical errors can really pop out, so you don't have to scroll and just look into the logs searching for whatever went wrong. And finally, I have a separate gem which is responsible for building my HTML report. So how is this report looking like? Well, we have the overview with everything that we want to see, and it's easy to present this to almost anyone in the company because it doesn't contain specific technical information. We have also an overview of all the features that we're testing, summary of all the scenarios that we have, but also we can see all the errors summarized at a single place, so we can see if a single error appears in several test cases, and we don't have to go test by test and mark that we have the same issue everywhere. And like I said, I have a JSON report which main purpose is to be displayed in the continuous integration. So here's how the default Jenkins plugin for Cucumber looks like. It's definitely not that beautiful, but you don't have to do anything except install it on your local Jenkins installation and then just point it to the directory where your JSON file is generated. So after giving you all those details, maybe it looks that it's really not that hard. And I was actually wrong. Anyone can do it. Well, before I admit to that, I want to show you a picture. It's a picture that I've taken at a very, very beautiful place. But you probably can't see that because my picture is quite bad. And to make it up for you, I'm going to show you another picture from another very beautiful place, which was taken by a friend of mine. And yes, anyone can take some picture, but if you want the result to be really beautiful, then you need to have a good camera and you need to have a person who knows how to use it and who has some skill with it. So it's the same with frameworks. Anyone can write a bad and unstable framework. I don't disagree with that. Building a framework is no rocket science. But if you want it to be good, you have to have the right tools, you have to have the right experience, and you definitely need skills. So thank you very much, and I can try to.
All right. Are we going to the questions?
Yeah?
Sure, we have time. So, who wants to be thrown at with the green cube? Questions? Who has questions? You better ask, otherwise I'll ask all the questions. Oh, there's one. There you go.
Hello. Thanks for the presentation. I have one question. Within the platform implementing the framework, I don't know what things specifically you're testing at the moment and what's a specific case, but in general, have you thought and do you care about reusability of code? Like usually, depending on the tests, there are many things that are being repeated, just like in manual work. So some kind of modularization or some other means so that you can reuse the code that has been already done for another test for a specific step. You got a question?
Yep, I believe I did. But in our company right now at SumUp, we are going for a slightly revolutionizing approach. So we are really against reusing code. Because usually when you reuse code, this is when you introduce the most problems.
Just a second, maybe you got me wrong. I didn't mean to copy and paste, but rather, for example, within like 5 different test cases, you have a specific step that is repeated. So within the framework, exactly the opposite of what you are saying, to make sure that when, for example, this step has been already implemented as part of another test, you don't need to write it again, or you don't need to copy and paste the code for it.
This is one of the basic features of Cucumber. So each step you define just once in the step definition file, and then you can use the same phrase as many times as you want in your test scenarios.
So the granularity within Cucumber is to this level with yours?
Sorry, didn't get that.
Yeah, this is what I meant. Thank you.
Also, actually, we are reusing some of the test objects. So, for example, if we create 10 test users, we are keeping those test users as a pool. So if I have a test case that requires a user with properties that are already present, I'm just going to take a user from this pool and not create a new one. But they're created in the beginning of the execution and destroyed at the end. So they're not shared between executions.
Right, so we have a question here, over here.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. A quick question. Do you experience tests are failing because some mysterious reason, they're fragile, they fail because no apparent reason, and when you rerun the test, it's working again?
It happens with UI tests. I think it's happened to anyone. Like, you can click the button every time you try it, but whenever you run the test, it says the button is not there, for example.
Exactly.
I mean, that's why we don't want to start with UI tests, because they're really hard to automate. And if you want to move really fast and get some coverage fast, it's not the best place to start. But with service tests, I have never encountered anything like this.
Yes, my question was more towards UI and UX testing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone? I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Just people are gathering courage to ask them. Yep, there's one. There you go.
Is it on? Hello. One of the things that I've seen with BDD is that people try to get business teams and business people to actually write the tests. Is that true in your case, and what's your experience been there?
I'm not sure that this approach works really well. Actually, I'm almost sure that it doesn't, so that's not what we're doing. We are sharing our scenarios with them and getting feedback, but even though that you have the steps, it's not exactly like building a Lego. I think that you need to have some idea how programming works in order to write scenarios, even with Cucumber.
So you rely on technical people or testers to build the test? All right, thank you.
Thank you. All right, more questions? Questions? I have a question. So you mentioned you're using Active Record, which means you're communicating with a database. And what exactly are you using the database for in the test framework? Because I find this curious.
Mostly to verify results, but sometimes we want to bypass the UI by authoring something directly in the database. If we're not testing this, but we just need to get the system in a certain state.
All right, so
fast forwarding.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Hi. I have to say I'm a little disappointed. No, joking. That's a great talk. I wanted to ask if you have embedded any technique of testing unit test, actually verifying unit test quality. Is that something that you've done in your framework or any prior frameworks until now?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
No, we're not testing the test right now.
Yes, you should.
Oh, you should test the framework, not the tests.
So yeah, discussions after this? Questions now? Any other questions? I guess then we can leave some time for discussion. So a big round of applause, everyone.
Thank you.